Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending what side of the globe you find yourself on. It is a great pleasure to be with you today to moderate this panel discussion on access to climate finance for SIDS, LDCs, and vulnerable nations. So welcome to everyone. You'll note in the chat box that we'd just love for you to say hi and let us know where you're joining from today. So if you could just open up your chat boxes and let us know, that would be fantastic. By way of introduction, my name is Rachel Welch Phillips. Oh, and we also have a poll that will have just popped up on your screen just to help us get to know you better. So if you could just answer the 3 questions that have popped up on your screen as well, we'll then be able to share some of the results from that poll. So my name is Rachel Welch Phillips. I am a senior associate at Dentons Delaney, a pan-Caribbean regional law firm, part of the largest law firm in the world. I'm a finance solicitor by trade, trained in the UK, and I'm now a member of the Corporate Commercial Practice Group at Dentons. I'm also the co-head of the ESG Steering Committee at Dentons, and I actively assist clients within the region on their ESG journeys to continually grow and develop their responsible business practices. I'm a passionate environmentalist and was an environmental policy advisor to the energy sector prior to becoming a lawyer. So it is a truly great pleasure for me to be here. The topic of discussion today is access to climate finance for SIDS, LDCs, and other vulnerable nations, a topic which many believe COP26 failed to adequately address. Let's start by considering what is meant by climate finance and why access is a problem. The UN Environment Programme describes climate finance as finance flowing to developing countries, including support for mitigation, adaptation, climate policy, and capacity building. Mitigation includes funding of renewable energy projects, energy efficiency initiatives, forestry and land use initiatives, and sustainable operations. Adaptation includes any initiative that enhances the resilience of a nation to the impacts of climate variability. Climate finance itself is both public and private, and the global financial structure is both complex and involves a multitude of instruments and actors. Public funding is often channeled through intermediaries who play a key role in raising and distributing the funds, such as national and regional development banks. Private funding may also be channeled through similar intermediaries, but can also be managed by private financial institutions and funds. Some private funding is also only available to governments, which many LDCs are in fact, while many LDCs are in fact seeing climate mitigation and adaptation initiatives led by the private sector. So why do SIDS, LDCs, and vulnerable nations have an access problem? For starters, the Climate Policy Initiative estimates that only 3.5% of tracked global climate finance flows are in the form of grants that need not be paid back. So 3.5%. Almost 76% are offered as market rate loans or equity. 13% take the form of concessional loans with cheaper interest rates. So the day-old question arises. Can SIDS, LDCs, and vulnerable nations truly afford climate financing? So that is an introduction to what we are going to speak about today. We have a wonderful panel of speakers who are going to address these topics with us this morning or this afternoon. And a few technical aspects before we begin. You will notice that all attendees are muted with cameras off, but we do encourage you to ask questions. Please put any questions in the Q&A and identify yourself with your name and your country and indicate to whom your question is addressed. We will select and read audience questions throughout the Q&A session to have your questions answered. This session will be recorded and is also being live streamed on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. So without further ado, please allow me to introduce the opening keynote speaker of this panel, who is the Honorable Gaston Brown, Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda and Chair of AOSIS. AOSIS is the Alliance of Small Island States, which is an intergovernmental organization of low-lying coastal and small island countries that was established in 1990 to represent and amplify the marginalized voices and interests of its member states in global discussions on international climate change, sustainable development negotiations, and processes. So please welcome the Honorable Gaston Brown, Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda.
Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank the organizers of the Island Finance Forum for providing me with this opportunity to highlight some of the major financial challenges small island developing states, SIDS, currently face. After 2 long and uncertain years, much of the world has shifted gears from COVID-19 response to recovery. Discussions at various fora have laid out pathways for sustainable recovery while advancing the 2030 agenda and objectives of the Paris Agreement. However, for most SIDS, this is easier said than done, as the socioeconomic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic continue to linger on our islands. There continues to be large shortfall in fiscal resources that have been redirected from development plans to response and recovery from the pandemic. The fiscal situation is further worsened by trade deficits caused by the heavy reliance on imports for basic necessities such as food and energy, while industries that contribute to foreign exchange earnings, such as tourism, have declined. As recognized by the United Nations and the international community, these impacts are disproportionately pronounced in SIDS due to our inherent vulnerabilities. While dealing with the global pandemic, we were also subject to a multitude of compounding external crises, such as climate change and other natural disasters, resulting in far-reaching and long-term financial implications. In this context, it is clear that the international financial architecture needs to cater to the needs of the most vulnerable to ensure that no one gets left behind in our collective journey towards achieving the 2030 agenda within the next decade. Unfortunately, this is not the reality that we are seeing on the ground. Most SIDS are excluded from accessing concessional grants and loans that are critical for recovery, as well as debt relief initiatives that could alleviate fiscal burdens based on the outdated and arbitrary criterion of GDP per capita, which has been utilized by the international financial institutions. While our call for better access to concessional finance has remained unheeded for decades, the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated the need to take affirmative action. SIDS urgently need the resources to shore up our resilience in preparation for the consequences of future global crises. Through the United Nations General Assembly, the Alliance of Small Island States, AOSIS, has initiated an intergovernmental process for the development and adoption of a multidimensional vulnerability index for SIDS by the end of this year. We are aiming to offer sustainable solutions to SIDS by ensuring that our unique and inherent vulnerabilities are taken into account and fully addressed when accessing international development finance. In the context of the Island Finance Forum, I wish to emphasize the necessity for financial institutions to expeditiously utilize this index in the mobilization of finance to ensure that developmental aid is directed to those that need it most. There are a number of opportunities this year where further information will be provided regarding the work on the index, and we encourage all stakeholders to closely follow these deliberations. Turning now to climate finance. First and foremost, I wish to reemphasize that climate finance is distinct and therefore additional to developmental finance. While they may have complementary objectives, they are different. As the Secretary General said, the outcomes of the most IPCC report, and I quote, is a file of shame, cataloging the empty pledges that put us firmly on track towards an unlivable world, end of quote. The emissions gap is looming, and current policies would lead to a temperature increase of 3.2 degrees Celsius by 2100. It is possible to close the 2030 emission gap, but this is not possible without a global shift in financial flows that are consistent with the 1.5 temperature goal of the Paris Agreement. There is a need to enable a global just transition towards net zero emissions by mid-century, while also ensuring that vulnerable countries such as SIDS have the capacity to adapt to the escalating impacts of climate change. Climate finance is also needed to address loss and damage that is being incurred by vulnerable countries at present. The latest science by the IPCC confirms that as a result of failing to adequately mitigate GHG emissions, climate impacts will become catastrophic for SIDS and in many cases untenable. Commensurate support must be provided to vulnerable countries to withstand these impacts according to the principles of justice and equity. COP26 in Glasgow took a step in the right direction, committing to the doubling of adaptation finance, but this needs to be the floor and not the ceiling. Financing adaptation projects in climate vulnerable countries would also break the cycle of increasing vulnerability and preserve their hard-earned economic gains through enhanced resilience to future disasters and shocks. Simplified access to finance is a perennial call by SIDS that goes unanswered. EOSIS has been recommending a concrete step to establish a forum by 2023 for climate finance providers to first compare their application requirements and second, to collectively simplify and harmonize their procedures. Capacity building and support are critical for SIDS, not only to adapt, but also to accelerate the transition to carbon neutral economies. The large-scale external investments and supporting regulatory framework can be further incentivized through a better understanding of risk, complemented by approaches to enhance resilience. Availability of updated data, statistics, and information continue to be one of the main obstacles to advancing this. I hope that the discussions at the Island Finance Forum will shine a spotlight on this issue, amongst others, where targeted support is required by SIDS. In order to leverage large-scale transformational change, support must effectively address the specific needs and circumstances of the recipient. I'm confident that the discussions at this forum will provide greater clarity on some of the more granular challenges faced by small island developing states. As the chair of EOSIS, we encourage all stakeholders to make full use of this opportunity, amongst others, in the year ahead to generate concrete actions for climate resilient economic recovery in SIDS. I thank you once again for this opportunity.
All right, many thanks to the Honorable Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda, Gaston Brown. You'll see on your screens the results of the polls. You can take a look at where everyone is connecting from. We have a strong presence from Europe and the Caribbean, closely followed by North America. The sectors are quite varied, strong private sector presence, but we have all industries represented. Strong finance and environmental services focus as well. But welcome to you all and thank you for joining us. So the next topic we're going to consider is what the political climate is for SIDS and climate finance flows following COP26. So here to share with us more on the UK government's attitude to climate finance, climate obligations for wealthy nations like the UK, and covering what needs to be done to address problems with climate finance is Kerry Mccarthy, Member of Parliament for Bristol East in Great Britain. Kerry is the chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Small Island Developing States, which she launched in 2021. Over the past year, the group has hosted COP26 President Alok Sharma and the UK's Minister for the Environment and the Pacific, Lord Goldsmith, alongside numerous representatives of the Small Island Developing States. She has visited several SIDS herself and launched the group primarily to provide a voice for the islands in the UK Parliament around COP26. Kerry has a keen interest in climate policy as a long-standing environmental campaigner and former Shadow Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Kerry, welcome.
Thank you. Just to get into grips with the technology. Thank you for that introduction, Rachel. And I was very interested listening to the Prime Minister's introductory remarks. I thought that gave a very good overview of the position from the SIDS point of view. Obviously, from the UK point of view, as was said, I've set up this all-party group, and I think we're very conscious here in the UK of the responsibility we bear for trying to lead on finding solutions to some of the problems that are facing the SIDS. I mean, partly because whereas the small island states themselves have historically contributed very little to the problem of climate change, yet are facing some of the very worst consequences. In the UK, spearheading the Industrial Revolution, with much higher carbon footprint and responsibility for industrialization around the globe. I think we are very conscious of our culpability in the situation that we find ourselves now, and also, of course, the fact that we have the COP presidency until the end of this year. As I said, we know SIDS face the very worst consequences, the extreme weather events, the rise in sea levels, ocean acidification, bleaching of coral reefs, all of that. But there's also, I'm very conscious of the other vulnerabilities of SIDS to other natural disasters, like, for example, we've had the volcano in St. Vincent, we had the volcanic eruption and tsunami in Tonga, and just the sheer vulnerability that comes from being small and in many cases being pretty remote from other land masses, and in some cases because of the poverty. So the fact that SIDS have very limited resources to draw upon because of their size to manage these challenges, and as has been said by the Prime Minister, they've been disproportionately affected by the COVID pandemic because of that reliance on tourism. Also, many of them are heavily indebted. So I formed the all-party group to give a voice to these vulnerable nations, particularly in the run-up to COP26. And it's a continuing dialogue. As was said, when we had our launch meeting, we had the Zach Goldsmith, the Minister for the Environment and the Pacific. His role spans the Foreign Office and the Department for the Environment in the UK, DEFRA. And he's very supportive of the group. And then we've also had the COP president come along as well. My view of COP, I did go up for a few days. In some case, it was a step in the right direction. There was some good progress on areas like deforestation, methane emissions, but I think it was a failure when it came to climate finance. And I think one of the speeches that resonated most with people was the speech of Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, on this topic. But we saw that no agreement was reached on a dedicated damages fund, although the UK did support that, but it was blocked by other wealthy nations. And as I've said, the contribution of the early industrialized nations in Western Europe and North America to climate change makes it particularly galling to see them blocking efforts to establish fair climate finance mechanisms for SIDS. We did get some progress at COP26 on ensuring previously agreed targets on climate financing were actually achieved. The target of $100 billion every year by 2020 has been missed, but it now appears that it will be met in coming years. We've obviously got to be very vigilant in making that happen. The negotiations will continue post 2025, and I think it's really important that we put pressure on global leaders to significantly raise the bar. The UN Environment Programme has estimated that by 2030, the developing world will have to spend up to $300 billion a year to cope with climate change. But it's not just, so that's one part of the equation, is trying to raise the money to make sure that there's money available. But then the problem is, and many SIDS have told me this, just they struggle to access the funding that is there through the Green Climate Fund. It's just a question of having the resources and the capacity to deal with the bureaucracy, the massive paperwork that's involved in making an application, and sometimes having to gather the evidence that's required to show that there's a problem and to show that the solutions would work. You know, the data collection tools, the monitoring of results of past work or of the outcomes. They're all things that SIDS need help with. And as has been said, sometimes they're seen as too wealthy to qualify for some of the help available, you know, from overseas development assistance, for example, or from the debt service suspension initiative. And I think the Prime Minister sort of pointed out that very narrow take of using GDP per capita is a really outdated approach. And I support calls for a global vulnerability index where the unique vulnerability of small island states is recognised rather than just using that very crude measure. On the topic of debt, I think one of our next speakers will have a lot to say on this from Jubilee Debt Campaign, but it is of course ridiculous to be offering SIDS grants or loans, especially loans, with one hand and then enforcing crippling debt repayments on the other. We've seen lower income countries facing increasingly unsustainable debt levels since the 2008 financial crisis, with debt payments increasing by 120% in that decade, 2010 to 2021. And SIDS have been particularly badly hit because of their reliance on tourism, because many have monocrop cultures, which are highly vulnerable to changing weather patterns and indeed to international trade deals. So I think debt is an area where the UK could lead. And one of the things we might hear more from the Jubilee Debt Campaign about this, but one of the things I've been talking to them about is the fact that the majority of international debt contracts are governed by English law. And by changing the threshold for the number of creditors that can object to a restructuring of debt, we could make it far easier for vulnerable nations to do that, whereas at the moment it only takes one creditor to do that. And this is something that I plan to bring forward, just backbench legislation to try to do this. We're just about to prorogue the current parliamentary session in the UK. We come back in May, so I'm hoping to push for that after that. I also very much hope that debt will be on the agenda at upcoming meetings of the G7, the G20 and the World Bank. But as I've said, I think Jerome, the next speaker, will have more to say on that. I just want to finish by saying a little bit more about the UK's presidency of COP. I'm in a different political party to the COP president, Alok Sharma, but I think he does have a genuine commitment to supporting the SIDS, as well as Zach Goldsmith, the other minister that was mentioned. The COP26 president met with finance ministers and investors last week to call for governments and multilateral development banks to support new green finance packages ahead of COP27. There was a joint statement by Alok Sharma and by his successor, who will take over in COP27, in the wake of the recent, what I was the terrifying IPCC report. And they said that finance must also be significantly scaled up and support the urgent just transition to a low carbon economy and deal with adaptation challenges. Now, it's all very well to say these warm words, and it's encouraging that it's being flagged as a priority, but there's no mention of a dedicated damages fund. And I think we really need to see more concrete measures. You know, we need to actually know what's going to be on the table for COP27 and really practical measures, rather than just saying that it's an important challenge. So to just conclude, you know, I really welcome the fact that this forum is happening. I think there's so much that we in the UK can do to help. I mean, the one thing I haven't mentioned is we are one of the biggest financial capitals in the world, if not the biggest financial centre. We've done a lot of work on developing green forms of private finance. Again, I'm very interested in blue finance and how we can help countries with significant blue economies to raise funds, whether, you know, that's getting investment from people who want to look at carbon offsetting. There's some interesting stuff being done in some of the overseas territories, for example, some of the financial centres that base there on this. And I think that's something else that we can lead with pushing. But we, as I said, we're very conscious of our role. I'm not in government, I'm in the opposition party. Very conscious of our role, though, at all these international fora that are coming up, and particularly at COP27, as we hand over the presidency, to try to make sure that the climate finance will be there for mitigation and for adaptation for the SIDS, rather than the I've sort of half an eye on the chat that's going on now. And I know some people are saying we've had these conversations for a very long time. I think we have, and I appreciate the frustration about how little progress has been made, but hopefully that, you know, with a lot of pressure, with everybody speaking with one voice, we'll be able to change that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kerry, for that insight. We've seen a lot of people in the chat really grateful for your contributions here. I'd like to encourage all attendees to continue using the Q&A function instead of the chat function. If you have a question, please pop it in Q&A, because that way we can keep better track of it for the Q&A discussion at the end of the panel. So thank you again, Kerry, for your contributions. And as you so aptly mentioned, we have Jerome Phelps, the head of advocacy from the Jubilee Debt Campaign. Jerome has been the head of advocacy at the Jubilee Debt Campaign since February of 2021, where he works on promoting just solutions to the sovereign debt crisis facing many countries in the global south. He has previously worked for 18 years in the migration sector, including as Director of Detention Action and International Detention Coalition, and as a consultant for the Council of Europe. So we are very pleased to have Jerome here with us to discuss the lack of climate finance alongside the impacts of the pandemic and the Ukraine war, all contributing to a challenging debt situation for SIDS. There has been a lack of political will in the G20 to ensure that the policy solutions are adequate to the scale of the problem or accessible to SIDS. But important proposals are being advanced by Caribbean leaders and bodies that can contribute to a just and green recovery. And Jerome is here to tell us more. Jerome, over to you.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you for the invitation to join this very distinguished panel on this really important topic. I think that the Prime Minister and Kerry have set out the context we're in of unprecedented intersecting challenges, which hit SIDS perhaps more acutely than almost any other category of country. The climate emergency, COVID recovery, and the impacts of the Ukraine war, alongside the failure to provide adequate climate finance, means for SIDS debt. If SIDS have to take on loans for climate finance, then that means a growing debt burden that's becoming unsustainable for many. Our calculations are that 54 countries worldwide are in debt crisis now, of which 8 are SIDS. So that's a really disproportional impact on SIDS. For the 21 SIDS for which there are available statistics, they're expected to pay over $5.6 billion this year in debt repayments, which is a huge sum for often very small economies. This issue is being pushed, as Kerry and as the Prime Minister have highlighted, by SIDS leaders. The V20 last week at the IMF World Bank spring meetings highlighted the debt distress facing SIDS in particular, and that debt repayments of many countries are exceeding public health spending, preventing investment in climate action. But I think as Kerry described, the moral leadership of SIDS and Mia Motley, COP26, I think provides a really important starting point and some momentum for movement to a more just system of grant-based climate finance and to address the debt crisis facing SIDS. And I think these are backed up not just by the really strong leadership in these fora, but also by some very concrete, plausible proposals, which I will come on to in a moment. Important to note that the response of the G20, the international body that has arrogated itself the responsibility to deal with the debt crisis, despite being very much dominated by creditor countries and recreating colonial power dynamics. The G20 response has not surprisingly been inadequate to the scale of the debt crisis. In the reaction to the pandemic, the G20 initiated a debt service suspension initiative, and then a common framework that was supposed to be a basis for restructuring unsustainable debts. They've both been failures, effectively. The debt service suspension initiative suspended a very small proportion of debt, 3% for the the Caribbean countries who applied, for example. No countries have yet had any debt restructured under the common framework. Only 3 have applied. So, as the Prime Minister highlighted, SIDS, who don't meet the GDP income thresholds, are excluded even from these inadequate schemes. So there's simply no solutions on the table at the scale required that are accessible to SIDS. So I think it's all the more important that these plausible proposals are coming from SIDS, being promoted by leaders of SIDS, including Mia Mottley. Obviously, she made a very powerful speech that captured a lot of imagination at COP26, calling for a fund for loss and damage based on fossil fuel revenues, for example, and an annual $500 billion allocation of special drawing rights of the IMF towards climate investment. I think that was a really inspiring example of the level of ambition that's required across the range of climate finance related issues. It follows on from there's been very strong demands coming from IOSIS as well. The debt statement in July 2020 was really the strongest statement by an intergovernmental body, calling for debt relief and increased resilience financing, and highlighting the importance of private creditors joining debt suspension and cancellation schemes, given that private creditors form an increasingly large proportion of creditors to not just to SIDS, but globally. And debt restructurings are simply not possible without comparable treatment of all creditors, including Western banks and bondholders. So I'll just speak for go into a little bit more depth about a particularly important proposal that has also been promoted by Mia Mottley and by the V20 group of climate vulnerable countries, the Debt Relief for a Green and Inclusive Recovery proposal, which is a fully worked out holistic package of bilateral and multilateral debt relief proposals. There's a strong focus again on the involvement of private creditors on a comparable basis. It sets out one route to having both a carrot and a stick to bring private creditors into collective debt restructuring agreements, which is a critical failure of the common framework. It's the single biggest reason why no debt restructuring has taken place yet. So it talks about the proposal is for private creditors to take a haircut on to reduce their amount of repayments they're demanding in return for guarantees for their restructured smaller debt. And the threat, the stick being the risk of receiving nothing if they refuse to cooperate with the restructuring. But I think, and really to echo Kerry, this is ultimately the responsibility lies with the countries that have caused and profited from the climate emergency, whose banks have often lent recklessly and who are now in many cases seeking full repayment from countries that cannot make those repayments without a dramatic impact in their ability to continue to develop their infrastructure to adapt to and respond to the climate emergency, not to mention the pandemic. So it is the responsibility to act, to follow the lead of SIDS leaders lies with the UK, with the G20, the IMF, World Bank. There's a real need to raise the game, to strengthen the common framework so that private creditors are obliged to cooperate, cannot simply sit on their hands and hope to be paid off to be bailed out by public money, in effect. To extend the debt relief and wider concessional financing to middle-income countries based on where climate vulnerability justifies it. And IOSIS and others are doing very important work on as the Prime Minister described, on the development of a multidimensional vulnerability index here. And also more broadly to work towards a global debt architecture that is fair, that recognizes the urgent sustainable development needs and in the climate emergency of SIDS. As Kerry mentions, there's a specific role for the UK and the US, in that the vast majority of debt contracts are governed under New York or English law. So this is something that we're working on with Kerry and others in the UK and in partners in New York, promoting legislation that would prevent minority creditors holding out, undermining collective debt restructuring agreements and seeking to be repaid in full to effectively profit from the goodwill of other creditors in restructuring their debts. So I think it's a crucial moment. I think that not enough has happened yet, but the momentum, the scale and urgency of the problem is building, and the leadership is there in SIDS. And the question now is turning it into action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jerome, for your contributions there. These are really important points. We're seeing a lot of Q&A questions popping up. Please do keep putting your questions in the Q&A, audience members. If you would like to have a general chat around the topic or make statements about what's being discussed, feel free to pop those in the chat, and please pop any questions you'd like directed to the panel into the Q&A section of the Zoom. So thank you again, Jerome. Let's now move on to our final speaker, who is here to provide us with insight into the Antigua and Barbuda experience of access to financing. We have Nadia Spencer-Henry, who has over 20 years experience in fiscal and debt management. She has worked with the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank and the Financial Services Regulatory Commission of Antigua and Barbuda. She is currently the debt manager in the Ministry of Finance of Antigua and Barbuda and has served in this capacity for the last 10 years. She has been appointed to serve for the 4th term of the board of the Green Climate Fund to represent SIDS from 2022 to 2024. She is also a doctoral candidate with the University of the West Indies Cape Hill campus, and her research interest is in climate finance. So maybe, Nadia, you can let us know whether you have more hours in the day than the rest of us. But we're very excited to hear more about Antigua and Barbuda as a highly indebted small island developing state in the Eastern Caribbean with limited access to concessional financing, limited fiscal space, and a high level of climate vulnerability. So welcome, Nadia.
Thank you so much for your words of introduction, Rachel. I think the speakers before me have set a good background to what I'm about to speak about. So my Prime Minister would have spoken about one of the initiatives being championed by AOSIS, and that is the Multidimensional Vulnerability Index. And what I will be talking about now is another thing that we're trying to triumph through the AOSIS, and that is the concept of debt for climate swaps. It is not necessarily a new initiative, but it is a more unique and innovative approach that we are trying to establish. And this is to look at debt for climate swaps in the ambit of official bilateral debt. The issues that we find ourselves facing, though, is that we are a country, as Rachel mentioned, we are already highly indebted, and we have very limited access to concessional financing. And some of the debates that we've been hearing from the persons that we've been speaking to is that because of this challenge, they would want to see this type of initiative blended with other sources of financing. And this has been a challenge for us to date. So a bit more about the project and what it hopes to achieve. So the Debt for Climate Swap project aims to deliver what I call an innovative solution that relies on the design and implementation of debt conversion focused on climate-related vulnerabilities. So the concept would facilitate the negotiation of debt for climate swaps with official bilateral creditors in the ambit where the country itself provides financing to do what we call a debt conversion or debt buyback, and then allowing this process then to free up necessary resources to pay for climate adaptation. In the case of Antigua and Barbuda, we have looked at this policy in two ways. One, we are hoping to champion it first for Antigua and Barbuda as a pilot, and then to further scale up to assist other SIDS in the Eastern Caribbean, as well as extending further out to be able to do this as part of their entire debt portfolio. It requires pretty much of an uptake and an understanding of what your debt portfolio looks like. And my previous speakers would have spoken about the issues related to SIDS and our highly indebtedness, and the fact that this crisis that SIDS find themselves in, doubled by both debt and climate-related vulnerabilities, is one that we would then have to take to our creditors so that they also understand that there is a marriage between highly indebtedness and the fact that you also have climate vulnerabilities that you cannot address. So as part of this, we are attempting to devote the savings that we make from the debt for climate swap and to put them into what we call resilience funds. In the case of Antigua and Barbuda, we are an accredited entity of the Green Climate Fund. So this means we can partner with the Green Climate Fund as an entity to support us in this initiative. On the domestic level, we also have some funds that we have set up. One is called the Sustainable Island Resource Fund Facility, which helps individuals and households to adapt their household to climate change by putting in innovative areas in their infrastructure and allowing them to be able to adapt in the event of any type of storm damage or other climate hazard. We are also seeking to develop what's called a Climate Resilience and Development Fund. This Climate Resilience and Development Fund, we are hoping to source from directed revenue streams related to tourism that we can then channel towards supporting development projects to become more climate sustainable, or what you'd call it, climate strengthened. So for example, this fund is expected to support projects like road projects and infrastructure projects that you don't generally find financing for from concessional financing sources and that you have to borrow for, but to support those to ensure that those projects are done in a climate resilient manner, thus really trying to make sure that our public sector investment projects are done in a climate resilience manner. We are also working along with the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, UNECLAC, and we are trying to advance what is called a Caribbean Resilience Fund. This is expected to help all Caribbean countries now to advance in their attempts to access concessional financing through different thematic windows. We are hoping that this fund would be launched with the support of UNECLAC sometime later this year, and they will be championing that. But these are some of the things that we are trying to really push forward from AOSIS. Finally, I want to speak a bit about some of the lessons that we are learning as we're going through this process. We recognize that because multilateral organizations cannot be a part of the debt dynamic discussion and they're not involved in debt conversion or debt buybacks, that they do, of course, have a role in helping us to structure correct arguments that different creditors can be understanding towards. They also have the role of providing us with the studies, the technical advice, and they also have the role of sharing with us concessional financing sources to help to finance and to champion some of these new and innovative financial options that we're trying to present. We also think that open communication on the part of SIDS and LDCs with their creditors and persons who offer them grant financing to ensure that the financing that they're offering them is fit for purpose and is able to really help them to adapt to climate vulnerabilities will help to advance the conversation further. And this open dialogue takes place on forums like these, as well as countries individually championing the cause on their own behalf. We're also learning too that creditors want to see that we are making some effort on our part to do some limited type of adjustment in the way we do business. We are small, we are vulnerable, we have very small areas of accessing finance, and we have a very small developmental pool of sources to pull from, but they want to see that we are using those financing that we are able to capture in a sustainable way and showing how we can continue to advance the cause of climate vulnerability on our own. And thus, as we do that, they would want to be able to support. So finally, in closing out and in supporting the points I've made so far, I want to point out how important it is for countries to focus not just on securing sources of external financing, whether it be grants or loans or other types of blended financing, but also to see if there are ways that they can find within their economies to domestically unlock sources of financing, because I think this is what we all desperately need, to unlock financing that is there. Everybody accepts that financing is available, but how do we unlock it? How do we untie ourselves out of this vicious cycle of having high debt, low growth, and limited access to financing? We have to try to find some way to forge ahead with making access. And we hope that through the Multidimensional Vulnerability Index, which increases access for SIDS and LDCs, as well as through this concept of debt for climate adaptation swaps, that as AOSIS we'll be able to continue to champion this cause on behalf of small island developing states. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nadia, for that very, very engaging session. I'd like to ask all panelists now to please switch on your cameras and you can remain muted until a question is directed to your attention, but if you could please all pop up on screen for our audience members as we will engage in some Q&A. So to the audience, thank you so much for the questions you've already submitted, but please continue to submit questions that we can put to the panel during the course of this Q&A session. So and please also do indicate if there is a panelist in specific you would like to direct your question to. Otherwise, I will just sort of pick and choose myself and also allow the panelists to contribute as they see fit to the questions being put to them. So the first question is around application processes for financing that is available. One attendee is asking, all the information we receive about SIDS having finance opportunities, yet the application processes can be long-winded and oftentimes not within the capacity of SMEs to bid for or make suitable attempts to apply for. This combined with a certain amount of corruption within government civil service bodies or intermediaries that are serving as the gatekeepers to the funds can result in less people applying, especially from a grassroots level. And the example we've been given here is the example of farmers. So solutions are needed to this now. There's a solution that's been put forward here by the participant that possibly university postgraduate students could be part of the CapEx and OpEx of rural farming groups, for example, to help with these sorts of applications. But let me just put it to the panel, maybe starting with you, Nadia, on your thoughts for limiting the barriers to access to already existing climate financing opportunities in the context of SMEs on small island states.
Thank you, Rachel. That's a very good question. And at the Green Climate Fund, this is something we often hear because, as you know, just getting accredited to the Green Climate Fund itself is a process. But one of the things that I've learned, and I keep talking to countries and to SMEs or even private sector individuals about in small island states, is that you cannot seek to do it on your own in your own country. Because we are small, we have to try to find a way to improve on economies of scale. So if we can go together as a group, sometimes grouping up with larger countries so that we could be able to access either accreditation or some type of access. One of the examples recently passed by the Green Climate Fund is what's called the Global Reef Fund. And in that particular instance, we saw a combination of small island developing states grouping up with larger African states and larger Latin American states to come together to do a fund that will help support coral reef, support their development and their maintenance. And one of the things that this fund was able to capitalize on as a group was to also get the support of a private creditor to support them in accessing funds from the Green Climate Fund. So if you are wanting to champion a cause, the key is to find like minds, come together as a group, take use of the technical assistance that may be available to somebody in your group, or access to a private finance source, so that you're able to then come together and to make access possible. Because often we, as you know, we have limited capacity in small island states. As your own country, as an Antigua and Barbuda, or just as a Trinidad and Tobago by yourself, you may think you're large enough, but you're not really when you're coming up against a really huge multilateral organization. So that will be my response to that questioner.
Thank you, Nadia. Jerome or Kerry, do you have anything to add to that? No, okay, let's jump straight into another question then. So is there a way to limit excessive leveraging of climate resources, and what have been the discussions around this aspect of climate financing? A lot of SIDS have limited natural resources, and the large task of sustainable development and minimizing environmental impact is often borne by local agencies that are short on resources, but there is no shortage of tasks that they're required to complete. So maybe, Jerome, maybe you would like to take this question?
I think I would defer to Nadia again on this one, if she's willing to take it.
Sure, Nadia, you willing to take this one on?
Yeah, so you're referring to tasks that we have to complete, and you are right. There are a lot of tasks that SIDS have to complete. We have biodiversity, we have coral reef issues, we have mangrove issues, we have disaster risk issues. And I think one of the speakers before me spoke about the fact that there is this great divide between development finance and climate finance. And so because of this divide, persons find themselves sometimes caught in a loop, and you're not really able to implement your projects. But there's two things that I want to mention here. One of it is being really able to genuinely show climate rationale for the project that you are doing, and to really be able to understand what your theory of change is. What are you trying to move from? So what's the data that's supporting what you want to move from to where you want to be? Often we can speak emotively about a crisis, but financing hinges on data. Being able to explain where you're coming from, where you want to be, and what's the climate rationale of what you're trying to achieve.
Great, thank you, Nadia. That's very helpful. We have a question here from Jerry Diaz from Guyana, who mentions that green energy investments are expensive, and investors and lenders might be slow to act in this space due to the risk of losing in these investments. Do you have any thoughts on how investors can be encouraged through green loans and green subsidiaries, especially in the context of concessionary funding? I'll pass this one to you, Jerome.
I will make a very superficial comment, and I think Nadia will probably have more to say again. I think it's an important issue. There's a really making it possible for encouraging financing is really critical. I think some projects can relatively easily be made profitable and are it's relatively straightforward. Others may not turn profits because not every aspect of the climate emergency is going to be profitable, particularly in the absence of loss and damage. So I think focusing it on areas where which are suitable for it. The risk is if it's left to SIDS to de-risk projects, which are inherently risky, then it can be another source of scarce public resources being effectively bailing out private investors on projects that haven't lived up to their expectation. So it's not, and there's a justice issue again of SIDS being required to take on all the risk for an emergency that's not of their creation. But I suspect there is more to be said on the issue.
I could just say something briefly before Nadia, who I think is going to be the expert on every single question. But I do think, given what's happening in terms of global energy supplies, with the situation in Ukraine and with Russia, I think people are becoming far more alert to the need for self-sufficiency when it comes to energy supplies. And I think the whole green energy moving to renewables fits in very nicely with that, because obviously island states are going to have to import their energy to a large extent if they can't generate it, through solar or whatever things like tidal or other things that build on the natural resources they've got. So I think that is really going to be part of international discussions, and now in a far more elevated way than it was previously. So hopefully that would help us. It's part about building the resilience, isn't it? It is about mitigation against climate change, but it's also about the resilience of the country. And I went to one SID recently where they were tied into a very, very long-term and extortionately expensive energy contract with one supplier for the whole island. There's no competition in the markets. And I think this is very much about improving the sovereignty of SIDS and not having to rely on outside companies in that way. That's ideally how we'd want the investment to work. So it was very much a locally owned project.
Right. And Kerry, while we have you, is there any role for governments, especially governments in more developed states, to create incentives for financial institutions to direct debt relief and creative financial instruments for climate financing in SIDS and LDCs?
I think it goes back to on debt, obviously Jerome's the expert, but I think it goes back partly to, there are products out there. There's a lot of products out there, but you're talking about countries which, I had a meeting this morning, for example, with the overseas territories, which aren't classed as SIDS, but they have very much the same issues. And across the 14 UK overseas territories, the population is 250,000. And I think the smallest is somewhere like Pitcairn, which has got about 40 people. They have huge tasks ahead of them. They've got huge marine environments, for example. There's a lot of biodiversity. We haven't talked about the Convention on Biodiversity, which it keeps being postponed, the meeting that China's hosting. But I think that's the other side of the coin, isn't it? Biodiversity, protecting the natural environment, protecting our natural resources, alongside, and a lot of the natural climate solutions fall under both that and under the climate change agenda. But islands with populations that are that small, so smaller than my constituency, aren't going to have it's having the ability to tap into those funds, and also the amounts of money that they will be after. A lot of financial institutions won't be interested in lending what to them is a tiny amount of money. So I think there is a role for governments to facilitate that. You've got to make the processes easier. But yeah, in some ways, I think with the Green Carbon Climate Fund, that's meant to be a mechanism through the finance gets channeled through there so that they don't have to be looking to the private sector. But it's definitely got to be made a lot easier. And some of the work, not expecting SIDS to do all the work for themselves, or smaller countries generally to do all the work for themselves.
Yes, and that also really creates the question of, do we have to sit back and wait on government action in SIDS, which can often be slower than private action and is also more susceptible to political change and changes in political will during the course of a term or in a transition period for the SIDS. This is an area that really requires consistency and stability in its approach. And the minute there is a change, you can take 10 steps backwards where you've taken one step forwards. So really, access to funding for private sector initiatives can be a way of creating that stability, whereas a lot of the existing funding is available to governments. And then the governments then have the responsibility of channeling it. But again, you encounter the same barrier of the time it takes for government action, as well as the hurdles in political transition and political will. So maybe, if anyone can speak on what access is there, what initiatives are there, or what will is there to create a larger private sector access to financing in this space, understanding that in fact private sector operations can get us to where we need to be a lot faster than relying on predominantly government access to the funding. Nadia, maybe you could speak to the private sector access versus public sector access point.
Yeah, so you really championed the cause of the private sector just now, but let me be frank, and Kerry said it when she spoke. The private sector is in it for profit. And if we are not able to show that there's going to be profit from a project or from an initiative, they're not really interested. And unfortunately, some things, especially like what Kerry spoke about, like biodiversity projects, etc., are not really interesting for the private sector. And this is why countries find themselves and SMEs and other businesses find themselves dependent on the slow government process, because the government will spend on it even when there is not a profit motive. But I want to come back to the issue of green energy, which the person spoke about earlier. And that is, green energy provides that way for the private sector to get involved, because there's a clear cash savings to be made from moving from fossil to green energy. The issue is the country able to show that they'll be able to make the necessary changes in terms of patterns of behavior, etc., to create the cash flow savings that they're able to then pay back whatever financing source that has financed the green energy. And this is a challenge. So sometimes a country may find themselves just not having the capacity. So a good grid study or a good mapping of what would be required in terms of green energy to power key sectors in the economy, so that you're able to make the case for the financing. So that's one thing. And the second thing I would say, outside of being able to make the case and to show the cash flow savings, is just the ability to implement, not having the training to be able to implement the type of technology that's needed. And so then we find ourselves leaning on a developed country that has the technology, has the knowledge, not only to just implement, but then to come back and to provide maintenance. And so we find ourselves in a situation where, like I said, if you're able to group up together, and then you're able to then have one country that can specialize in the technical aspects, another one who would focus on, advancing the financial discussion, then we're able to take the best of all of the worlds and to be able to marry all resources together. Otherwise, we'd find ourselves very dependent on developed countries, very dependent on whether the private sector sees something as being something that would advance their cash flows, or something that would be a good investment for them. We'll just find ourselves in that gap all the time.
Right. And maybe, Kerry, this could be one for you, just to continue on this topic. So this idea of SIDS often depending on more developed countries to assist them with the technical and the maintenance and the operational aspects of the projects that are receiving climate financing. In essence, you would need the cycle to be enhancing the economy sort of across the board for these projects to truly do what we want them to do and to be sustainable on a long term. So it really requires there to be a certain level of upskilling and educating and enhancing the local capabilities to sustain what is being put in place. Is this a focus of discussions that are happening from the UK perspective and on the various committees that you sit on, in the sense of actually channeling finance towards creating a means for SIDS to sustain themselves?
I don't think it really is. And I think SIDS get overlooked in terms of, certainly in terms of our foreign policy discussions, or whenever we look overseas, it tends to be motivated by the conflict zones, so Russia, Ukraine, and Syria, Yemen, or there's discussion that is very much based around how we spend our development, our aid budget, and SIDS tend to, so that you might get conversation. We've had an urgent debate in Parliament about the volcano in St. Vincent and the humanitarian relief that's required, but it tends to be prompted by things like that, like when there's tropical storms or hurricanes or whatever. And I think that's really important. One of the things that I've been told by SIDS is, because the bigger funding packages are by and large inaccessible to them because of the work that's involved in getting them, they can get smaller grants, but they are very piecemeal. So you'll put one little project in place, which is great, but it doesn't fit into that overall picture of everything that is needed to build the resilience of an island. And you don't really want to, we see this in terms of local authorities in the UK bidding for funding increasingly, rather than being given the mainstream funding that you just give to a local authority and they can implement a plan as to what they're going to do to improve the locality over the next 5 years. They have to keep bidding for pots of money to do particular initiatives. The government likes initiatives that they can announce and launch and get credit for. We funded this, we funded that. And it doesn't really work when you're trying to regenerate a community. It just means you have one win. And also it doesn't unless you've mainstreamed that funding, you don't get the continuity, so you can't keep it up, and you can't do those things that require. What you don't want is a company coming in, putting in renewable energy infrastructure or whatever, but there's no skills in the local workforce to maintain it and operate it, and you've got to keep relying on the private companies to come in and do that. So, I think what we want is bigger packages of funding that you don't have to jump through lots of hurdles, and it's long term and it's sustainable, and it really means that you can make a difference. And we're just not seeing that at the moment. As I said, we're seeing bits and pieces. I also think from what Nadia said, I'm interested. I do think that one of the answers is SIDS working together on projects and bids, but I just wondered whether this culture leads a bit too much to competition between islands, because again, if you've got pots of money you've got to bid for, not everyone can be a winner, and so do you end up trying to prove that Trinidad and Tobago deserves it more than St. Vincent or whatever. And that worries me a bit, because the needs are very similar across a lot of these islands, and we shouldn't be pitting one against the other.
Yeah. Thanks, Carrie, for that. I completely agree with you. We do find ourselves in that competitive space where we're trying to say our needs is greater, we had the larger storm, or more people were displaced, etc. And one of the things that we've been trying to push as AOSIS is to try to have us work as a unit. So we're now trying to talk to Pacific SIDS so that they understand that the issues that Caribbean SIDS face are not really different from Pacific SIDS, because for a long time, there were Pacific SIDS issues and there were Caribbean SIDS issues, and they're all the same. And what we've been trying to do, particularly on the debt side, because we all have debt issues now, some of the most highly indebted countries are in our grouping. So we have been trying to say, look, let's work together on this thing. The unfortunate thing is that requires a whole political framework that we have not quite set up. And so we're kind of still stuck trying to tackle some of these problems without the correct political framework. AOSIS is a start, I think, but we have to build on it. And I think we've been trying to get some of our regional groupings going on the Caribbean end and on the Pacific end, but we have to try to find a way now where we unify this voice when facing a UN agency, or even talking to a UK, or talking to the Paris Club, which is a debt forum, or talking to anybody for that matter, even the issue of renewable energy. In my own area, the Eastern Caribbean, where we share a central bank, the central bank is trying to push now for us to do a unified approach towards renewable energy. So they're doing a renewable energy facility. And they're hoping that we would all try to tackle it together, as opposed to be doing it separately, because it would be costly for each one of us. The transaction cost alone is going to cost us most of the financing that we'll be able to get. And I think that's the way to go. I can see no other way. We're just too small. Transaction costs are too high in the Pacific. Sometimes they're too remote. So the cost of transportation, which is going up because of these wars and inflation and so on. So we have to find ways. Every problem has an opportunity for a solution. And I think we need to be looking in that direction.
Right. Thank you, Nadia. Jerome, I'm going to direct this question to you. We have an audience member who's asking whether there are any initiatives to raise finance specifically for loss and damage, but I'll also expand that a little bit to be not just raising finance, but just the creation of financial instruments in the form of, such as Nadia mentioned, the debt conversion, debt relief elements, but specifically for loss and damage as a category in and of itself. Please give us your thoughts on that.
Thanks, Rachel. I'll actually start by picking up on Nadia's points around coordination amongst SIDS, the role of AOSIS and Pacific Island Forum and bodies like on that, which I think is critical. And it relates to the other question in the chat about the political will to address debt relief. And I think, which the answer is no, there isn't. They might arise, but I think what there's the power imbalance of SIDS being relatively small economies and but on a global level. And as Nadia mentioned, creditor countries are very organized in the Paris Club, in the G20 as well, in effect. Whereas every debt restructuring, the debtor country is alone against arrayed creditors with expensive lawyers. So I think coordination in the debt field particularly is a really important potential way of addressing that power imbalance and that need for aggregating and raising the influence of SIDS. And I think the debt conference is there was a debt conference with creditors in the Pacific last month, and AOSIS has one on the agenda as well. I think that's an interesting potential first step in that direction. But to come on to the question around raising finance specifically for loss and damage, I mean, which is a very timely question. There's actually an initiative announced this week by the V20 group of climate vulnerable nations to design and test a funding facility to address loss and damage. The key challenge for sourcing loss and damage, of course, is the unwillingness of countries responsible for the damage to pay. So there was obviously strong pressure for a fund at COP26, which was rebuffed. But there were important gestures, such as the Scottish hosts and the Walloon regional government pledging initial small contributions towards loss and damage. But I think this initiative is interesting because it's doing what the rich countries at COP refused to do. It's starting to pilot mechanisms that could disperse, implement loss and damage once that elusive political will is found to provide it. I think they have some seed funding from philanthropic sources, so it's not going to be raising anything like the sorts of money that's required at this point. But I think it's again showing that the mechanisms are there; they can be developed. What we need is the political will to address complex issues and put up the grant-based finance for it.
Great, thank you, Jerome. This question really is going to target Kerry and Nadia, as the question is about how to align long-term climate needs with the much shorter-term vision of a government policy. So a government that's in place for a term is painfully aware that it's in place for a term and that it may not come back and that there may be changes. And, so a lot of the gains that need to be achieved in a shorter term perspective, whereas a lot of the requirements for climate mitigation, adaptation and resilience, you may not see the results within the space of a term, and it may be a longer term picture that is producing a much, much bigger benefit for the nation. But what is the incentive for the government to really do that, almost to its own detriment? And given political survival is not going to be something that we see disappearing anytime soon, how best can small island states work to align long-term climate needs with shorter-term government policy?
Right. As you can hear from the background, the division bell's going, so I'm afraid I've got to run and vote, but I will say really, really quickly, I think that's where the international institutions come in. That's where COP comes in. That's where, the discussions that I had at G7, G20, and that continuity of finance. We are seeing quite a lot of political pushback at the moment, again, because energy bills are going through the roof in this country. So we're seeing climate become a bit of a political football, with people saying it's too expensive to move towards more sustainable methods, and we ought to be just exploring fossil fuels and so on. So we're as much a victim of that short-termism as anywhere else, but you need to create that international consensus that, sorry if the people couldn't hear because of the bell, you need to create that international consensus where everyone's tied in to those long-term objectives as much as possible. Sorry, I do need to run and vote, and yes. I won't be able to get back for the rest of the session, but I've really enjoyed it, and yeah,
Kerry.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you. Everyone, please join me in thanking Kerry for her contributions, and enjoy the rest of your day, Kerry.
Thank you. Bye.
All right, so let's turn the spotlight on to Nadia to hear her thoughts about aligning government policies with longer term climate action. And again, within the context of SIDS, so you'd probably be able to give us a good look at the Caribbean SIDS position, but a lot of this is also cultural, right? The amount of engagement you have from the public on these issues, as well as the sort of private watchdog institutions who are holding government accountable, et cetera, that is something that you see a lot in sort of more developed countries, but there may not be a culture for that just yet in SIDS. How can that maybe be developed? Is that something that you believe would be beneficial for holding governments to account regardless of political transition?
The answer is quite simple. It's called legislation. And that's what Antigua and Barbuda has done, because we are on a 5-year loop like everybody else in the Westminster system. Every 5 years, there's an election cycle. So we have what's called the Environmental Protection and Management Act, and there are a lot of things that are specified there in terms of our goals. So every year, every couple of years, there's a new ambition stated in the Nationally Determined Contribution to Climate Change, the NDCs, that are presented to the UNFCCC, and everybody presents them, and we're all proud of them. But if they're not anchored in some type of legislation, then those are just nice things that we say at COP, and everybody's happy, and we got the claps, and we're great. But unless you have that legislation locked, you're not able to move forward. And once you have a legislation, with that will come an implementation framework, some type of institutional structure to support the legislation that preceding governments would be forced to follow. And for them to change that would require them to go through another legislative process, which will be lengthy, will require consultation with the nation, and be much difficult for them to unmarry themselves from. So that is the way you solve it.
I guess the question then becomes, how do you incentivize action in the legislative space? Because again, there are many islands who are not seeing this taking place at the moment. But as you say, it can be really key to ensuring longevity of a policy and a position.
Yeah, so this is where the multilaterals come in, and that's why I spoke about them earlier, because they tend to tie these type of institutional changes to their financing. So you can get this grant of so and so on to transition your mangroves and make them more biodiversity and help to save the fish, etc. However, we require an institutional framework as a box to be ticked, as a conditions precedent. And in your field, these conditions precedent are pretty much unlocked. So if you don't have them down, there's no financing flowing. And this is how you're able to then leverage the support of your multilateral agency. So as opposed to making them tell you what you need, as a person trying to gain finance, linking it closely to climate goals, you have to be able to articulate to them what you would require in a financing. And if you recognize that the legislation is going to be helpful to you, utilize their power to help you to get the legislation passed. I've found that to be very helpful.
I hear you. And I guess this is where the collaboration point comes in again, because the average SME might be sitting there thinking, what is my access to government? But if you form groups and you network and you bring together like minds and form even a coalition, a group that can present itself jointly to the government in a way that needs to be heard, then that could maybe advance the cause even further. So again, we come back to this point of collaboration being really key. There's just one more point I want to touch upon, because a lot of panelists have been asking the question. It is very natural to think of SIDS as being excellent locations and optimal environments for the development of ocean thermal energy conversion technology. Yet it is not often something that we hear discussed at the larger scales, at the bigger conferences and committees. Can you share with us maybe some of what you believe are the barriers to accessing that form of technology, and why it may not be something that SIDS are able to jump into headfirst, or why it should be, if that's your view? So Nadia, you can share your thoughts with us on that.
So quickly, my thoughts on that are that I think we've separated these, because we now have blue economy and green economy. I think the separation has led to some distortion in us accessing financing as well. So countries that find themselves have a really good green package set up, we've worked for years to develop a green program that also had mixed in some ocean concerns, now recognize that they have to separate them out. So because of that, they find themselves in a situation where they're not able to really access some of these things that fall into the gap. And I think this is one of those things that fall into the gap. It's not purely a blue economy issue, and it's also not purely a green economy issue. And because of that, because you don't have a program surrounding it, the persons that are talking about it find themselves in a gap. I know, for example, when I hear about it, I go to some blue economy things and I hear about it there. And I also hear that green economy seminars as well. But no one creditor, financing agency or organization has really pushed it as an initiative. And this is how it gets noticed by SIDS, because we don't have the technical capacity to be studying all of these different options.
All right, thank you very much, Nadia. So I believe that this will bring our session to a close. Thank you very much to our panelists for their contributions today and for guiding this very, very interesting discussion. I hope that everyone here takes the opportunity to network with each other. Again, the conclusion being that, you know, joining like minds can be a real force to be reckoned with, and you can use that as a platform for advocating for what the needs are in your particular industry, on your particular island, in your particular nation. So a huge thank you again to the panelists and to our audience for your engaging questions. I believe that a lot of insight has been provided into both the challenges and the solutions in obtaining access to climate finance. We encourage you all to continue having these discussions as we endeavor to provide more vulnerable nations with access to much needed climate financing. So please feel free to keep in touch. Please add me on LinkedIn. Let us continue to have these conversations and continue to network and engage with the challenges ahead. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Nadia.
Thanks, Jerome.